Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's Saturday Talk. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mr. Sharan Setty. Sharan is a journalist and media entrepreneur, the founder of Bodh, an independent documentary and video platform focused on India's political, social, and civilizational narratives, and a former editor of Swarajya Magazine. He has reported from challenging and diverse regions, including Afghanistan, the Kashmir Valley, and parts of central India, and his work sits at the intersection of governance, national security, society, and public communication. He has also authored a book and produced research based on documentaries that have contributed meaningfully to public discourse. He is widely appreciated for going to the ground, listening carefully, and telling complex stories with clarity and balance. We are delighted to have him today, and he will be speaking on telling India's stories right. Sharan, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
First of all, this topic is very close to my heart, and a lot of people, not just if for those of you who may be active on social media, whenever you get some time, especially on platforms like Reddit and Twitter, there is this popular narrative that everybody keeps saying that India has lost its art of storytelling. And since many of you may be very close to home, which is Mumbai, the center for Indian films, in a manner of speaking, where globally we have the ability to tell stories. Often we felt that we have been misrepresented or we have been misunderstood in the sense of how we are represented, and that's been an inconvenience for a long time for many of us. But cut to like 2025, 2026, you look at movies like, say, Durandar and Noori on a lighter note, and you see that something has been gotten right, and you may be a critic of such films, especially on technical grounds. But the fact is that we've somehow seemed to have regained the art of storytelling. And why does this become very important in a larger geopolitical sense, where we are talking about, say, hard power, we are talking about soft power, we are talking about nations, taking advantage of supply chains and geopolitics, especially the way it is around the world, what is happening in Venezuela, what is happening in Ukraine, and how something what seems to be very insignificant like this becomes a crucial part of, say, the larger journey that India has on the global map, is what I also was privileged to study, say, for my master's dissertation back when I was studying geopolitics. So it's been 3-4 years or slightly more than that since I've visited this topic, and I'm glad that I have this opportunity to take you through this. So first of all, India has this big history of being the land of storytellers, right? We've told stories for different reasons. You have something called as a gade in Karnataka, which means that these are folklores that are told in 1 or 2 lines, very simply, which present wisdom to you, which present all sorts of moral instruction, governance principles, and cultural continuity. And these are seen throughout India's history in the form of like itihasas, puranas, shlokas, and different forms of storytelling that we've been able to master much before the world invented different other techniques, right? And a large part of it was also verbal, because verbally we've passed on a lot of stories, and that's how it's remained with us centuries after a lot of texts were destroyed, and say the destruction of libraries of Nalanda and other important institutions that have happened over the years. You look at Mahabharata, for instance, right? 100,000 verses, it's fantastic. And even today, in any house, you give examples of certain, characters from the Mahabharata, you quote your Puranas and Shastras and things like that. And that is how culturally we are centered, in a manner of speaking. Now, if you look at how India has had that history, and suddenly there is a dearth of confidence, say, in the way in which we project ourselves and in the way in which we tell our stories, and then you look at some of the stories that are told by the West, and we feel that there's a lot of confidence projection. And the reason is quite simple. Like, if you look at the American machinery, or perhaps, if I'm not I don't want to delve into this too deep, but whenever an empire rises, the hard power also has to rise with it, because that is how every empire, every country sort of makes itself prominent on the global map. But at the same time, it has a story to present. And for civilizational countries like China and India, we've had that background, we've had that story, we've had that cultural context in which we have always risen. If we were to look at how we treated our neighbors in the past, how diplomacy was conducted in the past, how and in what context we went to wars, say to the Sri Vijaya if we've ever ventured out on the seas in the case of Chola Empire. It's all been clearly documented, and it's just that somewhere in between, when we bore the brunt of say colonialism and other invading forces, we seem to have lost what are indigenous techniques of storytelling, and that is why something like this becomes very important. Because if I were to give you a small example, a lot of you may have watched Hollywood movies, especially for its action. Now you look at something like Black Panther, and there are sentences like glory be to Hanuman. And you look at Top Gun, especially. Top Gun is a movie that was completely backed by the Department of Defense, and you have a dedicated department which oversees a lot of the scripts that America is producing. So, in a sense, what Hollywood is doing is closely monitored by the who's who of national security in America, and it aligns with what the establishment would also want to say, except they've mastered the art of storytelling to such an extent that it seems very smooth and seamless. In that sense, the experimentation and the depth to which we could explore a lot of these are still quite nascent. Like if we look at the Shanti Parva from Mahabharata, have we tried projecting this on scale on cinema on the largest screens? I don't think so, but something as simple as a play called Parva is doing the rounds in the Bangalore circuit here, where the plays are being sold out continuously. So similarly, you get multiple hyperlocal examples of how we have been trying to master the art of storytelling once again, but it's a work in progress. But at the same time, you look at many of the conflicts that have been fought not just in the past, but even in the recent past, as early as before 9/11. If you look at the American invasion of Iraq, for instance, they had something called. So they've been building institutions over the years, so through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s, and they've always reformed institutions based on what they thought was important according to its time. Now, to give you an instance, during World War One and during World War Two, they had something called as Committee on War Information. So basically, what would they do? And public diplomacy is a term that has been invented today just to make it very glamorous and things like that. But before, in World War II, if you watch a lot of documentaries, especially about the Nazis and about Goebbels and people like that, you would see that propaganda was quite simple. You need to demonize somebody, you need to make sure that they are projected as the problem, and then you present yourself as the solution. Now, the American machinery, just like the British and Germans and everybody else in the world, also had this propaganda machinery that I think Woodrow Wilson actually put into place. And their objective was very clear. The domestic audience in America was never a fan of funding conflicts abroad, unlike the expansionist British Empire, which had its branch of East India Company, which would venture out on its own. America worked more as a more modern democracy which had evolved from the learnings of the British Empire and its mistakes. They could not conduct itself in the same manner as which other power and other forces would conduct itself. So what they did was quite simply, first the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, they were authorized to run psychological programs on its own citizens, because nobody was agreeing to spend their taxpayers' money on different wars. And I'm not talking about your Cambodia and Vietnams, which came much later in the 70s and 60s. I'm talking about, say, 1910s and 1920s, when the US even had to consider itself going to consider itself as a part of a global alliance to fight the Axis powers, for instance. And that is when, for the first time, a lot of these psychological experiments were started. So they use the usual channels like satellite radios and televisions and pamphlets, and as simple as that. And this is when their experiment with how propaganda can be used for building a story to justify a lot of the things came into picture. And after World War II concluded is when they reformed their institution. They realized around the 60s and the 70s that the word propaganda had become very unpopular. So what do? They basically repolish the whole thing and present it as public diplomacy. And this time what they do is quite simply they call it the United States Information Agency, USIA. And any of you can Google it and you'll get a history about it. The USIA, it was tasked to essentially counter some of the misinformation that was spread by the Soviet machinery back then. So they would have these huge, radio towers set up in Eastern Europe, in some of the Scandinavian countries, and they would project a lot of their propaganda across Soviet Russia. And that is how the initial days of how American public diplomacy came to be evolved. And much later, like in the 90s and the 2000s, the security also, the kind of complications in global conflicts also evolved. So what they had to do is slowly switch this to the State Department, and they brought in a lot of private players. The funny thing is that you talk about the Afghanistan conflict or you talk about the Iraq conflict, you had a lot of private advertising agencies even get involved in a direct or an indirect manner. And if I can quote an example, I think there was this woman called Charlotte Beers in around 2002. She was appointed to the Department of State, and she was overseeing a lot of this, quote unquote, public diplomacy, especially once the forces landed in Afghanistan, and the kind of programs envisioned for women and children there, the kind of justification that they had to do back at home, it was completely different, because in that context the public sentiment was also different. But essentially what they did was they produced a lot of literature justifying how people are quite backward there. And in that sense, you look at the other party, the legitimate power in Afghanistan, even they tried to do that through your traditional channels of, say, having mosques and imams and all of that. And information works in a different way. It's all about who you're trying to convey it to and whether they are buying your information or not. And that is when you realize that the whole legitimacy came into question, because that is how the American legitimacy was questioned over a period of time, over the 10 or 12 years they were in Afghanistan, and quite more than that. And the trillions of dollars that they spent was of no use, because ultimately the story that they built was so weak in its foundation that people found a lot of loopholes. And ultimately, locally, sitting abroad quite far away from the conflict zones, we may perceive something in a different way. But locally, what appeals to someone, appeals to them in a quite a different way, as it has been done in India as well, especially in the context of Kashmir. If you look at the Islamist era, that had a different sort of sympathy wave among certain circles in India. Even the Naxal movement, which has almost come to its conclusion in India, had its own sympathies in certain academic circles. And that was the unfortunate state of how misinformation had spread across. And today we are in a much better position where we are much more informed because of the internet age. But also at the same time, the complications also get much bigger. So empires in the past, it was not just their duty to conquer the land, it was also important that they control narratives because of how history, and not just history, but even the people would perceive them. So every empire relied on public storytelling, right? About how somebody was great, about how some invasion is justified. They justified conquest, they maintained legitimacy, they controlled population through one story or the other. And who better to quote than the British, where you look at the British education system today and the sort of stories that are told to their children, especially about, say, colonialism, it's almost absent. Even after a lot of awareness, it comes as a shock to the native British man or woman today when he hears about the kind of atrocities during the Bengal famine, during Jallianwala Bagh, and different other incidents that have had a massive, psychological impact on a big population in the past. So America's similar story has been that, stopping communism was one, stopping Red Terror was one, especially in the context of Vietnam. And then during Iraq War, it was the weapons of mass destruction, and we all know how that ended up. So essentially what this has transformed today is into information on your mobile phones. Like, there is just so much content, and content as an industry is I'm new to it. I'm an entrepreneur in this industry, but as and when I explore more and more, I just realize that every minute I talk to someone or talk about something on my phone, and then the next minute I have something countering me or supporting me, and that sort of information has been proliferated on our mobile phones. And that's the beautiful or the scary thing that we are experiencing today. So even on YouTube, your wars today, information wars are fought on YouTube, Netflix, your Instagram, and your podcast, where perceptions are consistently changing. And if you look at political parties today as well, they're investing a lot into information warfare silently, or another way, where they have different agencies tasked to do this. They empower and empanel a lot of influencers. Like the Content Creators Award is one such initiative that the government of India also has taken in this regard, in that sense, because they identify that content creators are becoming so influential, and they're becoming so powerful that they can have an impact public sort of sentiment and mood, just how Smriti Irani was perhaps quite relevant to the public sentiment 20 years ago, because anything that she said or did was very popular, because she was such a big star back in the day on soap opera. So today content creators can essentially influence public opinion. They can change culture, they can change a lot of consumer behavior, because if I'm following somebody and they recommend somebody, today I'm using a lot of sunscreen, a lot of skincare products which I was not using 5 years ago. And whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but everyone is essentially getting influenced by a certain culture that we see being represented on the internet. And obviously politics is also like a subculture that is big on this. Now, to give you an overview of why this becomes so important, content industry may be at its in a nascent stages in India, but it's quite well developed across the world, where people have identified this as a proper industry, especially because like in India itself, it's around $19 billion 2 years ago, and it's supposed to cross around 70 to $100 billion in another 2 to 3 years, and it's growing at almost 10 to 12% CAGR globally and even in India. So the traditional media may or may not survive, but at the same time, modern age communication methods, especially with a lot of our internet proliferation after the geo revolution and smartphones being accessible to a large part of the population in India, today everybody is consuming all sorts of content in Bhojpuri, in Kannada, and especially in regional languages like Marathi. You may be following a lot of influencers and their takes on different kinds of food and cuisine and culture and politics. And we've completely shifted from one form of a lifestyle where you used to go out, and completely today everything is on its phone, right? And so creator economy has taken a certain scale, and it's meant to grow. For example, Mr. Beast, which who is also producing a lot of content dubbed into Indian languages today. Indian consumers are so big that the whole company that he established is worth more than $500 million now, and it's one of the biggest content companies in the world. And even Canva, which was rarely used by, say, corporates 10 years ago, when we all started interning right after college or during college. Canva was this tool where we felt that it's a modern discovery. We could design a lot of posters. Of course, we found it really handy, but today a lot of my editors, my animators are using After Effects, they're using Adobe, they're using Canva, and without this our lives are sort of incomplete, because this is what we're completely dependent on. So in that sense, there's another industry, especially around designing, around equipments, around photography, cinematography, and these sort of things, which is becoming a business by itself, because everybody is investing on such things. And globally, digital ad spending is coming up, where people are preferring video ads. Something as basic as a biryani hotel in Bangalore is today becoming very popular, because they're investing heavily on Bangalore centric content. And I'm sure Benne, for example, in Mumbai, which is supposed to be a Bangalore dosa, but it's a Mumbai brand, is becoming so popular in Delhi because there was no dosa which was very crisp. And that is perhaps a big example of, like, say, how content, and people are lining up literally at 4 in the morning, and that trend, usually what it remains, like if a new movie comes out in the market, there will be a trend for 2-3 days where you wake up at 5 in the morning, say if it's a Rajnikant movie, and the hype eventually comes down. But it's transitioned from somewhat as a hype creating machinery to something of a stable revenue generator, where people are constantly reminded of something, and then it is pushing them to make them consume or buy, make a decision over something. And that is essentially how journalists have been replaced by creators, and that's the reality of where we stand today. And you look at India as well, like we are quite a big market, and we are growing at 16%, and there are around 100 million creators around the world, and a large chunk of them are in India and China, and around the world as well. We'll have close to 500 million digital consumers very soon. And if you look at how the regional languages have also been taken into account in a lot of these cases, it's quite massive. So the creator ecosystem is quite big, and essentially the creator ecosystem becoming big means that a lot of these creators have already penetrated the film industries as well. You look at Zakir Khan, and you look at Anubhav Singh Bassi. A lot of these comedians who would have never made it to the big screen are today on the big screen, and films are forced to consider getting creators, getting internet personalities on their thing. Brands are considered, brands are taking them very seriously, and every brand which perhaps does not present itself on the internet unless it is absolutely required, which is perhaps a good majority of them, is slowly will slowly going to decline. And we've seen that with multiple examples that's happened over the years, especially because content is the new marketing team, is the new sales team, and in a sense content studios are today's ad agencies. And that is how we've modeled my business as well. Because in the past, media houses have a different revenue model, which is perhaps unsustainable, because you are either dependent on, say, political favors, you're dependent on ad revenues, which are largely government or corporate oriented. But today I'm able to sustain independently, because I know content as a service is something that I've been able to provide. So tomorrow I'm not just building distribution and marketing it to the world, but I have a financially viable solution to run a team fully funded without having to worry about how we will sustain them. Because today I'm going to basically, a lot of companies are also approaching an agency to get their work done in terms of editing, in terms of any other creative work that they want. And that is how this void is today being filled. And obviously, India being so diverse means that the market is not just in one language, unlike in the West. There's a lot of regional markets as well, which are building up, especially if you've noticed around. I keep giving a lot of political examples because I'm a political journalist and I also cover security to a large extent. So please don't mind me giving a few political examples as well. If you look at Bihar elections, especially, you look at candidates like Pawan Singh, who was supposed to contest the Bihar election because he was becoming so big, or Manoj Tiwari in Delhi is so big. The importance of some of these personalities we often underestimate because we live in tier 1 and tier 2 India, where largely such cultural examples may not be relevant to people like us, but they connect to a larger audience that we may never be able to connect. And that's the reality of how powerful people have become because of say the internet age. What India was 3000 years ago, slowly we are trying to revisit that. And especially in movies as well, you look at the cultural importance that is being given even today in Bollywood, or at least they're trying. It's slowly coming back, and that is how today I think largely the content as industry is growing in India, and also we are trying to retell our stories.
From an industrial tech and robotics kind of standpoint, that is what we deal into. How companies like us, can contribute to the public narratives on technology and nation building in a way that informs policymakers and society, but at the same time, it preserves the credibility and the intellectual honesty. What are the ways to do this?
No, I think I get where you're coming from. A lot of serious people as well think twice about putting themselves on the internet, but that era of being shy is long past us. I think everybody, as a thumb rule, whether you're an individual or a big industry focusing on AI and robotics, you have to basically present your own story. And it can be as simple as, like I said, like a lot of these Dose brands as well are just putting out things in a very creative way. And a lot of the tech videos that we are seeing, especially unboxing videos, if you are looking at Instagram and YouTube, a lot of these emanate from China. And a lot of the marketing that is done for these products are also done through, say, TikTok and YouTube and platforms like YouTube Shorts. And once you're interested in, say, household appliances, as something as simple as an apple slicer, and the algorithm basically picks it up and then it continues to show it to you. And especially in the field of robotics, say, India is also growing its defense production, defense exports are growing, and especially in the age of Operation Sindoor, where people are completely interested in knowing where our jets are coming for, IAF Tejas. I think this is the right time that we put ourselves, our innovations on the board, and try to show the world what we are capable of.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. I have a question related to AI based something. With AI now able to generate text, images, video at scale, whatever happens when storytelling is no longer human concentrated? Does abundance dilute truth or democratize voice? Or the other question is, when AI can produce infinite pursuit narrative, does authenticity become the new scarcity? Or how should audience verify human intent?
There will be a large part of confusion, especially with AI. And if you look at some of the videos, ma'am, it is almost becoming impossible to distinguish. But if you look at the videos very closely, right, you'll be able to distinguish by, say, the absence of pores on somebody's skin, because a girl is looking way too beautiful and they're trying to market a soap or something like that. And unfortunately, people do fall for traps, and it's been true across all communication eras. It's not just the internet era or the AI era. So in that sense, AI is very important, and AI in that sense, of course, creates a scarcity. But that being said, brands which are smart enough take that to an advantage. Today, you do not need like fancy cameras and equipments to basically make content out there. You need something extremely simple, and the more authentic it is, the more it sells, because AI may not work wonders for everybody and all sorts of products that we are trying to sell. So in that sense, like something as simple as a video on your phone in your local native language will give a lot of boost, because it is very authentic as compared to AI, which may not be able to understand the complexities of, say, a language, or how beautiful something which is said in a native language can be. So in that sense, it's a boon, especially for us as creators, because a lot of my explainer videos today do not require like hundreds of physical hours sitting and doing patching up elements and doing all of this, because my editors are able to like basically generate a lot of AIs that go in the background. But at the same time, we are able to maintain the authenticity because we know what not to do with AI. So it's just that the more we experiment with this, I think the more advanced we become with how easily we'll be able to use this as a tool.
Previously, there used to be a beat journalist that used to follow a particular sector or a particular geography, and from his beats, the stories would go to assistant editor at a national daily or a regional daily, and then eventually the story would filter to the top. So now that we have the internet and different people are able to upload stories, content, pictures. As a media professional, Sharan, do you think that we've lost the filter for good stories in India?
Because if you look at even how content is basically funneled and how it's sifted, if I'm somebody who does not who has an average brand out there, who may not be extremely good looking and who's trying to market something one day and market something else on the other day, generalists find it generally very difficult to sustain as they have in the past, and that's something that we suffer. But whereas you have a certain type of content that you're producing, even in news, in that sense, it is easier because somebody follows me because they follow political news. Somebody follows another person like our mutual friend Anant because they are interested in foreign affairs, correct? So in that sense, even the internet has certain filters to basically like funnel out different people and give them a visibility advantage because they focus on a certain specialization. It's taking its time because everybody, like the internet is also slowly evolving, but I think we will not go back to generalization, but we will go to an era where there will be hyper specialization. That is what at least I feel when I consume a lot of content.